people with schizophrenia are often the people in society who are unseen and unheard. Whether it's the homeless population that has schizophrenia, the large percentage of people with schizophrenia that are currently sitting in jails or prisons, whether it's the people that are diagnosed, have treatment, but are almost infantilized and treated like they can't succeed. We often are in society, but not recognized.
Welcome to Get Unstuck, Move Forward with Your Life. I'm your host, Jason Hopkins. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we are joined by an extraordinary guest who has turned his life's challenges into a powerful mission to inspire and advocate others. Kody Green, a 28-year-old diagnosed with undifferentiated schizophrenia, is a motivational speaker and a social media powerhouse with over 1 million followers on TikTok. Kody's journey hasn't been easy. He's faced addiction, incarceration, and profound mental health struggles. But through resilience and determination, he's transformed those experiences into a platform for change. Trained as a peer support specialist, recovery coach, and suicide prevention specialist, Kody is passionate about raising awareness for schizophrenia, supporting recovery from addiction, and championing second chances. In this episode, Kody will share his powerful story of recovery and resilience, offering invaluable insights on navigating mental health, overcoming stigma, and rebuilding a life filled with purpose. Kody, it is a pleasure to have you here today. I'm so grateful to have this conversation. I'm excited for it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jason.
So, again, I really want to get into all of the phenomenal things that you're doing, but I don't think we can get there if we don't go back just a little bit. I know you've been so open about your journey of living with schizophrenia and other challenges that you faced. Can you give us a little bit of the backstory about, kind of what brought you to where we are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So my journey with schizophrenia and mental illness actually didn't start with myself. It actually started with my mom. So when I was a preteen, my mom started having auditory and visual hallucinations, as well as paranoia and delusions. So uh, it was confusing. We grew up in a rural area, so there was not a lot of resources. There's not anyone we could talk to, and it was really hard for us to figure out what was going on. And it wasn't until, almost until I went off to college before she got a proper diagnosis and treatment. And so, right before I went to college, she got diagnosed with uh, schizoaffective disorder, which is a combination of schizophrenia and a mood disorder.
Right.
And so, basically, my whole high school life was being a caregiver for her while also trying to go to school, trying to work, and bring in a little bit of money to the house. She was a single mother working 3 jobs, and suddenly her kids were her caregivers. And so it really showed me at a young age how misunderstood mental illness was, how stigmatized mental illness was, especially diagnoses like schizophrenia. And that gave me, a lot of insight into the illness. But unfortunately, when I went off to college at 18 years old, is when I started having my own symptoms, and I started suffering from auditory and visual hallucinations as well as delusions and paranoia. So all
Right.
of the symptoms that I had watched my mom go through, I was suddenly going through. And that's what really led into, me losing my job, me dropping out of college, and falling into addiction as a way to try to self-medicate, as a way to try to cope with what I was dealing with. And then for several years, I dealt with addiction and incarceration before I was able to get my diagnosis of undifferentiated schizophrenia, which led to me being able to get treatment, medication, resources. That's how I found out about peer support, and it's really how I got involved with advocacy before I started social media.
Mhm. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like you've been impacted by mental health one way or another for much of your lifetime. And going through this journey with your mother, I can imagine, that was incredibly challenging as you guys were all trying to navigate going for her being the caregiver and provider into needing the caregiving herself. Was there something that kind of perpetuated you ending up with a diagnosis yourself once you went to college? Do you think it was the accumulation of stress, or you don't really know? Like,
Well, it's definitely something that I've talked to my psychiatrist about, and with right now with what we know about schizophrenia is that it's caused by a combination of genetics and environmental factors. So I already had the genetic predisposition for it because my mother had schizophrenia. So the rest could have been any slew of environmental factors, like you said, stress of everything I had been through as a caregiver, but also I was on my own for the first time. I didn't feel great about leaving my home to go off to college and leaving my mom and my siblings to try to figure out the situation at home. So
Right.
it's definitely something where I think the stress could have played a role, but it's there's no way to there's no way to know for sure because to this date we don't have a solid idea of what the true cause of schizophrenia is. It's still a lot of research being done in order to figure out the root cause of the diagnosis.
Right. And as you mentioned earlier, it sounds like it took a while to actually get a diagnosis.
Yeah, and so compared to my mom, it actually was a fairly early intervention. So I always tell people that, I struggled with active addiction and active psychosis for roughly 2 to 3 years. What people don't realize, and what I think is absolutely shocking, some studies have shown that people with schizophrenia, on average, don't get help for 10 to 11 years,
Right.
which is so long. And the problem with that is the longer a person goes without treatment, the more damage it has cognitively. So the difference is very evident between even like me and my mom. My mom went almost a full decade without any sort of treatment or medication, anything like that. And so because of that, she is still on disability. She never really regained the stability that I was able to regain because I spent less time in active psychosis, and I was able to kind of come out of treatment and with medication that left me a little more able to process thoughts and emotions and be able to communicate my needs. And not everyone with schizophrenia has that opportunity, even if they get treatment and medication.
Right.
So early intervention becomes a really big part of this conversation with people with schizophrenia.
Well, and how serendipitous that you were able to recognize what something was going on, and you already had been availed to the path of what it looked like towards getting treatment. It sounds like you getting earlier intervention certainly made a significant difference for you. I guess the question is, you had mentioned that you had an active addiction. Like, do you believe that addiction was perhaps your way of managing symptoms in advance of you getting a diagnosis that perhaps helped kind of as your coping mechanism?
Sorry, could you ask the question again?
Yeah. So basically, the you ended up in active addiction prior to you having a diagnosis. Do you think that your addiction was a side product of finding a coping mechanism to deal
Oh,
with what later was diagnosed?
yeah, absolutely. When it came to my addiction, it was directly me trying to escape what I was experiencing.
Right.
And so it was a result of me trying to silence the hallucinations and trying to basically find moments of relief from these symptoms. And although in the time I thought that's what, the drugs were doing was giving me relief from the symptoms, what it was actually doing was giving me very, very temporary relief for very worsened symptoms. So I
Okay.
would get brief moments of quiet from these symptoms that would actually lead to darker, more intense hallucinations, but I couldn't build that parallel in my head. I couldn't figure that out because I was in a very delusional state. And so, although I knew everything that I did about schizophrenia because of my mom's diagnosis, it was very hard for me to understand, given the delusional basis of the disorder, that that's what I was struggling with. So, the addiction was something that I was doing in an effort to really try to silence some of those symptoms that I was having without actually seeking help.
Right. And with the best intentions, it actually made things worse, it sounds like. And
Yeah.
that's not an uncommon story. I mean, for anybody that's listening, that's like, oh, why are you self-medicating and doing that? I think that's a natural reaction that a lot of people go through. And, this is manageable and navigable. And by your own admission here, like it sounds like it actually made things worse.
Yeah.
Given all of the history that you had with your mom, were there other obstacles that you really came up against in trying to maybe embrace that something else is going on? I will end up with a diagnosis here. Are there other things that stood in your way just based on the history you had of the experience with your mom?
Um, there wasn't as many barriers, so much because of her history. When I actually got into a doctor and psychiatrist, having her being diagnosed actually sped up the process a lot. So,
Okay.
because she had a schizophrenia diagnosis, and doctors and psychiatrists know there is a genetic component to the illness, when I actually was able to get into a doctor, several years into this psychosis and addiction, it led to a very quick treatment process. I was From the moment I stepped into a doctor to the moment I got diagnosed and medication, it was a matter of a few weeks, and that is not the typical
That's not
timeline
common.
for. No, no, and I get to speak to patients all over the country, and people sometimes go months, if not years, from the first time they walk into a doctor's office with concerns until they actually get a diagnosis or get medication that works for them. And so it was because of her diagnosis that that process went as quick as it did. The main barriers I had was, between the addiction and the incarceration. Those were really my main barriers to getting help. The first time I reached out to try to get help with something, and when I reached out, I wasn't doing it because I thought I had schizophrenia. I just started to recognize that I couldn't do what everyone else did. Like, I couldn't hold a job, and at that point in my life, I was sitting in jail for drug charges, and I wasn't able to like build or maintain healthy relationships, and all of these things just made me realize like maybe there's something wrong with me. And so I started reaching out for help while I was incarcerated. And because I was also a recovering addict, the correctional officers thought I was pill seeking. So they refused to let me talk to anyone. They thought I was just trying to make excuses to get out of my cell. And so the entire time I was incarcerated, I did not get any help, even though that was the first time I was literally asking for it. And so I think that really showed me how much work needs to be done in our jail and prison systems in the United States, because we have a lot of people, and as someone who's been incarcerated, I can tell most people, because they don't realize, if you've never been incarcerated, you don't understand that most of the people in our jails and prisons in the United States are people who are mentally ill or recovering addicts.
Right.
Very few people that I met while I was incarcerated were bad people who just needed to be there. Those people do exist. There are bad people out there, but a majority of the people in our jails and prisons are people who are either, diagnosed or undiagnosed with mental illness, or drug addicts, or both.
Right. And isn't that unfortunate, because we perceive that the criminal justice system is really about rehabilitation, and
Yeah.
by your own admission, and I have my own experience with jail, like that is not at all what's happening in a jail. And the fact that you're sitting here sharing and we're actively reaching out for help and there was no lifeline being offered there is really a failure of the system, because frankly that is the perfect opportunity to give somebody the skills to find and maintain sobriety and to get treatment for the things that they struggle with, so then they can go on, like yourself, to be productive, functional parts of society. And like you've
Yeah.
gone on to do very well at this. I guess from that experience of being incarcerated and not getting the help you need, what was the turning point for you that really the light bulb came on? Like, not only are you going to get the treatment help for yourself, but like you're going to use your experience and voice to help others.
Yeah. So as for the treatment, there really wasn't a point where I thought that I needed help. What happened was, when I got out of jail and I was denied assistance from the correctional officers there, I went to my mom and my wife at the time, girlfriend, and they had been, by my side supporting me for those, 2 almost 3 years of me in addiction, me in psychosis. They both knew what was going on, but I didn't. And so they tried to get me help, and I refused. And the only reason I actually got help was because I went to them and I basically said, like I told the correctional officers, like, I just want to talk to someone, because I think something's wrong with me. Once again, I did not think it was schizophrenia. I thought it could even be like a physical illness that was causing like fatigue and memory loss and stuff like that. And so I went in thinking I was going to go get help for some sort of physical illness, or, anxiety, something like that. And what happened was, my wife and my mom, during this time period where I was in active addiction and active psychosis, they had been gathering resources for me. So part of the reason my treatment process went so quickly was the day that I reached out for help, my mom and wife already knew of someone locally I could go see the same day, who would give me a referral to a local psychiatrist that I was able to meet within the week. And then all of that led to my very quick and prompt diagnosis. So I got help because of the people in my life who kind of went out of their way to make sure that I had all the resources I need. But the reason that led to advocacy was because one of the resources they provided to me was peer support. And when I was first diagnosed, I felt super alone. You know, I lived in rural America. There was not a lot of good resources out there for people with my diagnosis. The only person I had ever met with my diagnosis was my mom. And so when I got this diagnosis, it really felt like a death sentence. Like I had never seen any positive portrayal of people with schizophrenia in the news or on TV shows or movies. It was always like a very negative thing. They were either completely disabled or they were committing some horrendous act. So I was terrified that that meant I would not be able to do anything my whole life.
Mhm.
I even had a doctor after my diagnosis tell me that I would never work, I would never be able to build or maintain healthy relationships, and that I should just accept that I'll be on disability for the rest of my life. So when I found peer support, the two things I noticed right away was the first thing that I noticed that I wish I would have known earlier was that I wasn't alone in my diagnosis. Not only were there people with the same diagnosis, but similar symptoms and similar issues and similar experiences with addiction and incarceration. And then I also realized that there were people in the room with me during these peer support meetings that were living full and functional lives. And I know this sounds so weird when I tell people this, but I didn't know that was an option. I
Right.
did not know that a person with schizophrenia could live a healthy, functional life with medication and treatment. And so, like, I never pursued that. I never tried to be that person until I realized that it was possible. Because no one in my life, including doctors, ever made it sound like a reality. And so, peer support really is what got me into advocacy. It got me working with NAMI, which is the National Alliance for Mental Illness. I went to my very first peer support group meeting in 2015, and last year I was elected the vice president of board of directors for NAMI Wisconsin because they've
Congratulations.
been such a big part of my journey throughout these years. And when working with NAMI wasn't enough for me because I wanted to do more and I wanted to reach more people, I decided to start sharing my story online, and it reached people in a way that I never could have imagined. And within 2 years, I was over 1 million followers on TikTok. And just in the last few years, I started sharing my story also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And I've been met with so much love and support. And obviously, it's the internet. So there's also negativity, hate, misinformation. And so I've spent the last really 5 years of my life trying to educate people about the illness and really paint a picture of what schizophrenia looks like day to day for someone.
And I love that. I'm so grateful that we have voices like yours willing to do this work. And you know, the thing that really resonates with me is that aloneness that you feel when you get a diagnosis and go through this, and you think you're the only person that's ever been through that. You know, and then to really be embraced in a way to recognize that I am not alone and there is support out there, and this can look completely differently than what the system is telling me it is. And how disheartening to think about the people that are treating, you know, folks with conditions like yours and others, and giving them such a bleak outlook around your life is going to look like this. Like, there's not a lot of hope in that story. You know, similarly, you don't know this, but you and I have, you know, some similarities in our history. When I had my breakdown and was beginning again, you know, the first place of support I ended up with is my mom calling and saying, "Hey, your dad and I took this 12-week family to family course at NAMI, and I know they have peer support. Have you considered this?" And I remember it was a November evening in 2012. I walked into those rooms the very first time, and you know, I had a similar experience of recognizing very quickly that while my story didn't feel like anybody else's in the room, I didn't feel alone. I felt welcome and I felt understood. And I
Mhm.
think there was real power for me in imagining what building my life back was going to look like from that point. You know, and then of course, like you, I've gone on to lead one of the largest affiliates in the state of Colorado for the better part of the last 10 years for NAMI. Um, you know, I want to reiterate for anybody that's out there listening, there is hope and there is help and it is available. And it's, you know, often as simple as, you know, sparking a conversation, because I, like you in the very beginning, told my story a lot on stages. And I was always amazed, and I'm sure you can affirm this for us. I was always amazed that me showing up in that moment of vulnerability and courage and sharing my story, how other people would show up to share what they were going through.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but that feels like the basis of connection.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, for me, and I've told this story on social media too. What really impacted me was when I first went to a NAMI peer support group meeting, I didn't say anything. It was several weeks before I ever actually shared my story. And the day I did it, I remember, and this I think was the shifting moment for me where I was like, it gave me such a feeling of hope for myself, for other people. I got done sharing my story. The meeting ended, and a woman who had been coming a few weeks, same as me, not saying anything. She came up to me after the session was done, and she told me that me sharing my story gave her the confidence that she was going to come back next week and share her story. And that immediately gave me such a feeling of like, okay, I did something that helped someone and it mattered. Because at that point, it's like with my diagnosis, I felt like I hadn't done anything in years worth anything. Like I hadn't helped anyone, I hadn't accomplished anything. And all of a sudden, I had this immediate impact of like, okay, maybe I can help people through storytelling or through sharing my own journey. And that's really what led me into this journey through advocacy.
Well, and isn't it amazing to have that aha moment of recognizing that this thing that is profoundly impacting my life that I am struggling with has a potential to help somebody else? Like, I don't know about you, but for me, that was like the most gratifying part of recovery was just recognizing that just showing up in a moment of vulnerability really can change somebody's lives, you
Yeah,
know,
no,
and
absolutely.
there's real power in that. I guess the question from your perspective of somebody that's listening that's really struggling or they feel isolated, what do you think is a valuable next step that they can take just to kind of get back out there and have the experience that you and I have had that made a huge impact?
I will always advocate for peer support when I'm talking to newly diagnosed individuals. I think it is so crucial and important in having a community, remembering you're not alone. It is so easy to isolate when you have a diagnosis. It is very common, and it's in my opinion one of the worst things you can do when you're struggling with something like this. We do live in a day and age now where I think people need to remember peer support doesn't mean you have to go to a basement in a church and sit around with a group
Right.
of people. We have online peer support groups, we have content creators, we have podcasts, we have radio shows. There is so much content out there to help you feel less alone in your journey. So whether it's in front of people, whether it's over the computer, whether it's listening to a podcast, whatever it is,
Help is
try
available.
yeah, there's so much out there. Try to find something that you resonate with, that connects with you. And I like that is always the first step. For me, I think the other thing was really trying to step out of my comfort zone and set goals. I'm a huge fan of goal setting. I think for people with severe mental illness, it can be the deciding factor of becoming one of the statistics that the doctors, try to scare us with, or really becoming like the people that we know we can be, or the people that we thought we could be before our diagnoses. And so for me, goal setting started really small. I always tell people there was a point in my life where, I make to do lists every day, and I've done that for years now. And there was a time in my life where I actually remember waking up one day and there was only three things on my to do list: wake up, get out of bed, take medication. And I couldn't even do those three things.
Mhm.
And so for people to see all the cool stuff I get to do now, like I travel all over the country and speak to patients, I do podcasts, I've been on magazine covers, I've done all these really cool things, but they all started with those three to-do list items. And I still, to this day, those are the first three to-do list items on my checklist.
Right.
And I like when I tell neurotypical people that, or people who haven't struggled with severe mental illness or ongoing mental health issues, a lot of people look at me kind of funny. They're like, you have to check off that you got out of bed. And I have to explain to them at one point, that's all I could do. And so I'm a very big fan for goal setting and to-do lists. And I think, start small, start as small as you can. And eventually, it's like now my to-do list are pages long. And I love that for me. I love that I'm able to do that. and that I want to do all those things, and that I'm able to, set new and big goals every day. I know you had mentioned you have a book with the premise of this show. I actually have a book coming out in January too, and like that was I remember the day I woke up and I got to write the first chapter of your book on my to-do list, and that was incredible. Like I get emotional thinking about that because I remember that day, and it was just this year where I got to write that down. And like I said, at one point all I had ever written down was get out of bed, take your meds. So
Right.
um peer support and goal setting, I think, are crucial to people who are newly diagnosed or people who want a place to start.
I just love that. And you're such an inspiration, Kody. I can't wait to see your book when it comes out. And, it's interesting. I was a guest on a podcast this morning and we were talking about my new book, Get Unstuck and Move Forward with Your Life. And, the thing that I am reminded of in kind of my own journey of recovery is this next right step approach.
Mhm.
And, I think in life, the analogy I look at is we all are going up this staircase. And, most of us go up a staircase one step, maybe two steps at a time if you're ambitious. But the fact of the matter is, it's built upon a series of steps. And I think so many of us get into this mindset around we have to be at the top of the staircase. We forget there's all these steps between here and there to get up.
Yeah.
And I love your approach, and having led peer support groups for more than a decade, of sometimes having just that list of those three things is so critical and so valuable just to move forward. And I want to encourage anybody that's listening, sometimes focusing on the top of the stairs really negates the fact that you're going to still take steps to get up it. And the reality is even those smallest steps matter. They still are a step forward. And I think that's really important for anybody to listen. Like when you think that it's too big or you can't do it, like start smaller. Like it's still a step. Make those three things, make those two things, and do what you can to do it. It's still a step forward. So, kudos for that. And I'm glad that we were able to talk about that next step approach. But I guess my question is, and you've given us some really valuable insight here, what are the misconceptions you see in talking to the people that you see? Mental illness is so misunderstood. And, even the system, as you conveyed to us earlier, puts you in this kind of box of your life is going to be very small and very limited. Let's talk about the misconceptions. What do people not see that they need to know from somebody that has lived with and is successfully navigating kind of the ups and downs of the diagnosis?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions about both mental illness and mental health in general, and then about schizophrenia. One of the things I hear a lot about mental illness in general is a lot of people think that someone who struggles with mental health or mental illness isn't going to be able to live a full, productive, functional life. And I see that a lot with schizophrenia too. So the doctor who told me that I would never work, I give him a hard time. I talk about him a lot, but people don't know that, one of the most recent statistics I saw was that 90% of people with schizophrenia don't work. So there is some, when he said that, he was going off of looking at my symptoms, looking at the statistics, and he took his best guess that, I probably wouldn't be able to function or work in the capacity of most people. That being said, every person's journey is different, and everyone is going to have, different access to resources, different access to things to make their journey more complete. And so I've been very fortunate that, whether it's working or being able to build and maintain relationships, that I've had a lot of support through my care team. But I've also went out of my way to educate myself about my diagnosis.
Mhm.
Some of the other misconceptions I hear about schizophrenia specifically, there's still a huge misconception that people who have schizophrenia or severe mental illness are dangerous or inherently more dangerous than any other person. And this talking point has been used so many times, but as many times as it's been used, I've heard people try to remind others that people with mental illness are actually statistically more likely to be the victims of violent crime than to commit violent crime.
Right.
So it's definitely something that, I know we're trying to make efforts as advocates to remind people, but that is still a big misconception that's out there. In terms of schizophrenia, I also have a lot of people who assume that because I have schizophrenia, that I wouldn't be able to really accomplish anything in terms of functionality. So I work is one I bring up a lot because for me, The book I have coming out is called Minds Over Meetings. It's literally about mental health and mental illness in the workplace.
Okay.
And it's about all of the different experiences I had as someone living with schizophrenia, trying to work a 9 to 5 job. And I worked in so many different industries, trying to figure out what workplaces would be accommodating, learning to ask for accommodations, learning my rights as a worker. A lot of the reason I think that people with mental illness can't work isn't because of their illness, it's because no one is willing to accommodate them. I meet so many people every day who would love the opportunity to get back into the workforce, to get back into being able to reintegrate themselves into society, but society doesn't believe that's possible for them, and so they don't get the opportunity.
Well,
Um,
the thing that you're saying there that really resonates with me about this in different language is society doesn't see them.
yeah,
And there is an element of for you to see me puts you in a different responsibility of what comes next. And it's
yeah.
easier to put you in this box and assume that you're going to be in that 90% category when the reality is it literally sounds like it was a matter of you figuring out what resonated for you and you've taken off and gone.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, and I actually love that you tie that in because the podcast I hosted last year is called Unseen and Unheard, and it's
love
all about people with schizophrenia. All of the people I interviewed are other schizophrenia patients who have gone on to do incredible things. I even got to have a conversation with my mother on the podcast. But the idea of the name was that people with schizophrenia are often the people in society who are unseen and unheard. Whether it's the homeless population that has schizophrenia, whether it's the large percentage of people with schizophrenia that are currently sitting in jails or prisons, whether it's the people that are diagnosed, have treatment, but are almost infantilized and treated like they can't succeed. We often are, kind of in society, but not recognized.
right.
And I think that could be said for a lot of mental health issues and mental illnesses, especially depending on the community you were raised in and how engaged they are with resources and conversations about mental health.
I agree with you. And the thing that's coming up for me, Kody, and we've touched on this a little bit, and really, you walking into those rooms and listening for a few meetings before you shared, how important do you think vulnerability is, and what role does it play in healing and finding connection?
I think it's I don't think you can really heal, especially from a diagnosis, until you've been able to be more vulnerable. I try to explain to people too that uh everyone sees me now on social media and my life is out there. Like if you want to know anything about my life, it's out there on
Right.
social media. And that's, that was something that people get to see now, but don't realize that that was not how I started with this diagnosis. That's not how I started with mental health or mental illness. In the community I grew up in, mental health was looked at as a fault of your own. Like you did something wrong. It's a mind over matter thing. You should be able to be stronger than this. And so I felt ashamed of it for a long time. And something that also played a role in me being able to talk about this diagnosis was I never mourned my old life. And I think that's so important because at 18 years old, I was in college. I knew what I wanted to be. I was going to school to be a teacher. I had all these goals, and I was a pretty high functioning person. I was, despite being a caregiver for my mom, I had graduated high school. I was going off to college. I had all these goals and ambitions. And then suddenly I had a psychotic break at 18 years old. And my life that I live now is amazing and I love it and I'm very grateful for it. But it's not at all what I wanted to do. It's not what I planned to do. I always get a lot of people that ask me why I chose to become a mental health advocate. I don't think anyone chooses to be a mental health advocate. I think they're brought into it either through their own experience or through the experience of being a caregiver. And so to me, it's so important to be able to share those stories to help people get through their own experiences. All I wanted when I was first diagnosed was someone that I could relate to. And I think the beautiful thing about what I do is I get to be that voice for someone else now. And that is, I couldn't ask for anything better than that. But it
Well,
takes on my end a lot of, like you said, it takes a lot of vulnerability to be able to share these details of my life.
Well, and I'm going to push back just a little bit. I do think you achieved your goal. You are a teacher.
Yeah, thank
Aside
you.
from being a mental health advocate, you absolutely are that voice that is changing how the world sees mental health. And frankly, my personal mission in life is to evolve how the world sees mental health. And like you and I are doing that. And I think
Yeah.
it's because these unashamed conversations and showing up and letting people know that they're not alone and that there's, a possibility to have hope for your life. Like, I think you touched on something a minute ago about mourning your old life, because I mean, it's taken me literally a decade to go back and unpack all of that happened to me during that time period. And, the reality is, I find so many people, in having led peer support groups, to put different language to it, is they live in that space of waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah.
And I think it's really, really a dangerous place to live in that, because the fact of the matter is if you're constantly waiting for the shoe to drop to go back to where you've been and what you rose out of, you're negating all of the progress that you've made, the tools you have, the connections you have, the support system you have, to know that even if things got bad again, it's going to be very different, likely, than what it was before. In your experience, how have you seen that people not mourning that loss of an old life or are waiting for the other shoe to drop? How do you see that impacting the people that you meet and deal with? And is that a legitimate thing?
Oh, absolutely. I think a large amount of the patients that are really stuck in that point in their life. The main reason that it's difficult to move on from that is if you don't give yourself the chance to mourn or move on or accept that life could be different or life could be better. I know I've been there. My mindset was very much like, what's the point? If I do all this work and then I end up right back here, what's the point of trying? What's the point of taking the chance on new medication? What's the point of trying to get back to work? Like literally, it came down to what is the point if this is where I'm gonna be again?
Right.
And so I think another thing that's frustrating is sometimes, and this was also part of my experience, and I'm sure part of yours too. I was doing all the right things. I was taking my medication. And when I started having setbacks, that's where I started falling back into that mindset too. I'm like, oh, if I'm going to have setbacks or still have symptoms or whatever, then why am I doing all this work?
Right.
And I think it's really hard to accept that that is unfortunately part of our journey. Like, for whatever reason, in our own journeys as people with mental health issues or mental illness, we have to jump more hurdles. And I think when you were talking about the stair analogy, where I'm mentioning hurdles right now, I also think of it like people I feel like are either trying to find the top of the staircase, like you said, or find a finish line. So we're jumping all these hurdles, hoping that there's a finish line, and then we get exhausted because we keep doing it and we don't
Right.
see a finish line. And
Right.
so for me, I try to look at my recovery both through addiction and through mental illness as an ongoing thing. So I try to set a good pace. I try to accept that I might trip over a hurdle once in a while. I might trip up a staircase or a little bit, or and you when you were talking about your staircase analogy, you said a step forward is always a step forward. I would even argue that two steps forward and one step back is still a
Still
step
going
forward.
forward.
I think that can be hard to accept, especially if you haven't mourned your old life, if you haven't had a chance to really deal with the difficulties and traumas of what you've been through as a patient. You have to give yourself the same love you would give someone else struggling. And that's what I realized. I was well into my advocacy before I realized all this. And I would be so loving and caring to other people. And I would be so understanding of everything they had been through. And I didn't give myself that same peace. I didn't forgive myself. I didn't look at my journey the same way. And so you got to be willing to advocate for yourself before you can advocate for other people.
Well, I love that, and that's so important. And whether you get to loving yourself initially, it really
Yeah,
starts with giving yourself a pass of grace and recognizing
exactly.
that step forwards are step forwards, and even if you have setbacks. I guess the question I'm left with here is, as we're drawing to an end here, is you know you've got all these great things going on. You're, an advocate, you're a speaker, you're a peer supporter, you're about to be an author. You're doing all the things. Like, I know not every day is easy, and the passion to do all that every day. Probably there's some days that are more challenging than others. How do you navigate the ups and downs today, in spite of having this huge platform that really has made you kind of the centerpiece of this topic? How do you navigate that?
I think the big thing for me was whether it's I give this same analogy to caregivers, and this is such a common saying, but you can't pour from an empty cup became a huge uh, constant reminder for myself. That if I don't take care of myself, I can't be the advocate I want to be. I can't be the caregiver I want to be. I can't be the person that is a voice for other people. And so I've had to really focus on taking time to step away from social media. I've had to focus on taking breaks from projects. I've had to turn down events. I do everything around my well-being.
Mm.
And that, it's inconvenient. And I recognize that, and it sucks sometimes. But as you know, because I had to do this to you, sometimes I have to like cancel meetings because I'm
Right.
having a more symptomatic day. Sometimes I have to reschedule stuff and shuffle stuff around. And fortunately, I'm in a very good space. The mental health community is very understanding of things like that. And because I'm a motivational speaker about illness and mental health, people do give me a lot of forgiveness for that. And so I try to really utilize the ability to be an advocate for myself as much as I would for anyone else that I come in contact with. Because when I meet other people on their own journeys, nothing they do or say would make me disappointed in them when they're in their recovery journey. I want to support them through whatever setbacks they have, whatever issues they're going through. And so I figured out that I had to do that for myself too. And
I
so
love
I've become very good at setting boundaries and making sure that as much as I love everyone that I work with and I love being an advocate, I need to take care of myself first.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I mean, it's really ultimately about leaning into our humanness and recognizing that, doing more of what fills our own cup. I mean, it took me almost a decade to figure that out. Like I'm doing all this work to serve other people, and I found like I was constantly depleted. And what it came back to, it was a beautiful spotlight on shining to recognize that, you got to take care of yourself first. You can't pour from an empty cup. Kody,
Mhm.
I'm so grateful to you for this conversation. I love what you're doing. I celebrate what you're doing because I mean the world just needs a lot more of what you're doing, and so thank you for that. I guess before we wrap up here, is there a way that our listeners can get in touch with you, can learn more about you? Of course, we know you're on TikTok, but share with us how they can connect with you and your work.
Yeah, so you guys can find me on either Facebook and LinkedIn is just my name. It's Kody Green, Kody. And then on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, my username is schizophrenic hippie. It's a long story about the username, but
Love it.
and so I also have a website. It's kodygreen.com. That's where you can find out more information about my speaking, my book, and a lot of the other advocacy I'm doing on a daily basis. And I just wanted to thank you for having me on and being able to share a little bit about my journey with your audience.
It is, the pleasure is mine. And if you haven't done so, we'd love for you to subscribe to Get Unstuck radio show pages. You can find us at Get Unstuck Radio on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Next week, we'll have another inspiring guest that I guarantee you will not want to miss the conversation. And one other thing, if you're interested in my book, you can find Get Unstuck and Move Forward with Your Life at Amazon.com. Kody, before we wrap things up today, I always like to ask my guests one thing that they're grateful for today.
I'm really grateful for the caregivers in my life who make my day-to-day life possible so that I can continue to do advocacy and inspire other people.
I love that. That's beautiful. And I'm grateful for you being here today. So thank you again. Until next time, remember every journey begins with a next step, and you too can be your own champion. Thanks for joining us.